Aiden Aslin joins us in the podcast studio. Aiden, it's lovely to see you and smiling in the way that you are. We will talk an awful lot about what happened to you at the hands of Putin and his men, if we can call them that. But I want to go all the way back to 2018 to start, the point at which you entered the Ukrainian Marines. How does a man come to a position of joining the Ukrainian Marines in the way that you did?
So yeah, I mean, it's good to be here, and it's a good question you brought up, because like not many people know like how does a foreigner like join a foreign military. So going back to 2018, at this point, like as I talk about in the book, I looked at going to Ukraine to start a new life for myself, and also to acquire Ukrainian citizenship. And I'm more of a like moral principle person, so I figured if I'm going to go and acquire like Ukrainian citizenship, I should at least offer something back in return. And at the time, I think it was in 2017, the ex-president Poroshenko, he passed a law that allowed foreigners to serve in the military. And I'd been following the Ukrainian conflict since 2014, when the original revolution started with the mission to oust the ex Yanukovych. And so I knew quite a lot about the conflict, and I'd been following it along. And then obviously after I left Syria, when I joined the Kurds to fight against ISIS, I'd come back 2 times before, had not so nice experience with the police, with the way they handled that and treated me after I returned. And that was my main goal for wanting to leave the UK. And having known the background on the conflict in Ukraine, it was something that I supported, because I knew what they were fighting for and fighting against. Obviously going back to Syria, Russia's involved there with what they've done there with their atrocities, so I know a lot about the Russian side of things. And the Ukrainians, they're fighting for democracy, to be with the Western world, because they want to get rid of the chains of the ex-Soviet system. So that played a big part in wanting to go out there. So what I did was I looked online at various places where I could go start a new life, and in the beginning it wasn't primarily to just go out there and fight like some people would think we would. I did look at the French Foreign Legion back then, and when I was in Syria, there was a lot of friends that I had. They were all ex-legionnaires, and they just told me to avoid it non-stop, because it's not as good as it sounds.
I can only imagine, yes.
And I that's when I became aware about the law that allowed foreigners to serve legally in the Ukrainian military.
The violence that you'd seen though in Syria, fighting ISIS of all things. I mean, that didn't deter you from continuing a career in the military.
No, actually, aside from the violent stuff that you see, over time you become desensitized to it, because of it's just the way the mind works. I presume anyone who works in the military or in any similar even war correspondents go out there, they become desensitized to the stuff over time. And I think a part of it as well was just the way life is when you're in that sort of environment. You're with your fellow brothers in arms or sisters in arms, and you kind of build a lifestyle out of it. So when I joined the Ukrainian military, it felt probably more relatable. I could when I went back to Britain, it was pretty tough for me to just go back to normal after everything I'd seen. I didn't really particularly like the lifestyle in Britain, just because of how detached everything is from what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
So when I did go to Ukraine, I fell in love with the place straight away. I did my research and found out how to join the Ukrainian military. So the process for a foreigner at that time, if they wanted to join the military, you would have to turn up to Kiev, and then you would have to go get all these medical tests done and get all the documentation to say that you're not insane or anything. You go to the recruitment center, and you basically go through the same process that a Ukrainian goes through. Also, at this point, bearing in mind, I didn't speak any other language.
But that wasn't a huge bar, was it? Presumably.
Not really. I'd been in like Syria before. I didn't speak any Kurdish, and like over time, like I'm pretty good at like picking up the language like pretty quickly. So I can speak Russian to like a fair degree. But my biggest problem with the language is like the correct pronunciation, because there is some Russian words that are incredibly difficult to pronounce. Same with the Ukrainian language. So it didn't take me long to like pick up like the basic commands of what I need to know and like what I need to say.
So tell me how the situation in and around where you were, how it gradually worsened, because we have all now seen the pictures.
Yeah.
You are lucky enough to have seen what the place looked like before the Russians came. I am not, and all I know of Mariupol is destruction and rubble and death.
Yeah. I mean, the past 4 years I served in the Ukrainian military, I'd been in that like region for like 3 years, like in between my deployments. You know, I think in total I've probably spent a year and maybe 7 months on that area from our deployments. And Mariupol as a city was like a pretty Soviet-esque like city. However, in like recent years, like Ukraine had done a lot to like bring it up to the standards of like other cities. So Mariupol was a up and coming like developing city. There was a lot of potential like was being put into it, and like there was so much investment going on to just make it a city like that's people want to come to. And I'd been to it a few times.
You found yourself in the steelworks. Describe those few days when, you know, your ammunition is beginning to run low, other supplies are beginning to run low. Morale can't have been great either at that time.
Yeah. At the end of March, we'd been under siege for about a month by that point, and we all knew like what the outcome of this would be. You know, by this point, we were about 145 kilometers away from Ukrainian lines, so we knew we were cut off. There's probably a slim chance that we're going to get out of this. We were preparing the vehicles that we had in our units, and that the other units, like being in a steelworks, there's a lot of steel and a lot of equipment are like laying around. So we quickly got to work, like preparing like the trucks and stuff, like welding like steel onto the side of them, because we basically were planning to try and break out and drive to friendly lines. And we also knew that the chance that we are successful isn't looking too good, but we still prepared for it. And in the first week of April, that's when we like ran out of food. So we had all the vehicles ready, like units came from the positions and everyone was ready to go. It was like probably 2 o'clock in the morning, and just at the last minute, like it was cancelled for some reason, like I don't know why. So we returned to our positions, and it wasn't until the day later, I believe it was, that the aviation located the trucks where we had loaded the ammunition into, and in the trucks was the entire like battalion like ammunition. So once that was hit, that was like the moment that we realized like it's going to be all over. We have no ammunition, we have no food. Like what can we do? We've got like heavily like injured soldiers and civilians that need like medical attention. Like there's not much else we are able to do anymore.
When you say requiring medical attention, I mean, what were the injuries that your comrades were suffering?
We had all sorts of injuries. We had like people that like, lost limbs, people that were like had concussion that needed like urgent medical attention. I think in my bunker alone there was probably about maybe 300 like injured that were brought in after other positions were like fell to the enemy. And then there was, of course, the evacuation of the local hospital, where they split the injured up into different areas to be attended to. And, you know, by the 10th of April, like other positions in the city had been told to pull back into the steelworks, because it's just not sustainable anymore to hold the lines, because we don't have the ammunition. And I think it was the night of the 11th, our commander made this decision to give the options for those who want to stay and surrender officially, or whoever wants to try and break out in the vehicles, they can tag along, or if you want to, you can try and like escape on foot. Going back to my experience from Syria, like I knew trying to break out in vehicles wouldn't be successful just because of how entrenched the Russians have been for like the past month.
Suicide, essentially.
Yeah, suicide, essentially. The day before, when we had the option to go, like I was like fully determined to go, like I was like ready to go, and then when that was cancelled, that's like blew my like enthusiasm to actually go ahead with it this time.
So when you are presented with this list of options, and you're someone who had been serving with the Marines for 4 years, you'd served previously, of course in Syria. I mean, what is the thought process at a time like that?
It's hard to put into perspective.
You don't want to surrender, certainly
Yeah,
not to the Russians.
yeah, of course. You know, like being in Syria, surrender was never an option because you know 100% what's going to happen to you. In Mariupol, I remember thinking to myself, like, okay, I can't go out in the trucks because that's pretty much suicide. That's not going to be successful. And then there was the option of like trying to escape on foot. And I remember asking my commander, I said to him, like, I was thinking that might be a good option, but then I asked him how many of us were trying to get out, and at that time, like he said, pretty much everyone. And I was like, okay, that's going to end in disaster.
You're a military man, so I mean, you have presumably at points, thought about your own mortality and that this might be it, and this is the end. When you were in that factory in Mariupol, what was the predominant thought in your head? This is it, or did you think that there was still a chance to live?
At this point, for myself, I knew as a foreigner, like I had already accepted that I probably have 90% chance of being just killed. I accepted that. One of my Ukrainian friends who had been injured, he had some shrapnel in his leg. He was like super scared, and I remember seeing him. I tried to like comfort him because he too was surrendering because he's injured. He can't walk. He can't go out in the vehicles. And he was telling me that he wanted to shoot himself, and at that point, like I knew I stood most likely to be just shot like by the Russians when I handed myself in, but I knew with him being Ukrainian that he would suffer like brutality, but I knew eventually he would eventually go home to his family. At that time, I didn't even know what to expect. Really, and I convinced him not to do it, and he went into captivity. I believe he's still in captivity, unfortunately.
Tell me about that moment when surrender took place, when you are taken into captivity and then taken away from comrades. Describe what happened at that point.
They loaded us onto a bus and we were driven to a town called Sarsanar, which is a village just in between Pavlopol and Mariupol. I'd been there quite a few times because it was our village we went to get supplies and stuff. So we were driven there. As soon as we got off the bus, that's when the intimidation and violence started. We were put into a warehouse and they put us into stress positions straight away. Stress
positions are?
So we were stood up with our head like against the wall, and we had to keep ourselves off balance with our arms behind our back. I think in total we stayed like that for 11 hours with moments in between where you'd get called out and you would have to like give your documents, and they would ask you who you are. When it came to me, they did the same thing. They asked, like, I gave them my military ID, and then I gave them my veterans card, and then I gave them my passport. But my passport, it has a Ukrainian cover on it, so if you look at it, like, you wouldn't think it's a British passport. And I remember when he opened it, I was like, this is going to be interesting. He opened it, and he was like, moronically, like, just looking at it and then looking back at me, and he immediately like asked me in Russian, like, where am I from? So I replied to him in Russian, like Great Britain. As soon as I said Great Britain, he like punched me on the nose and like beat me a few times. And then some of his senior told him to stop. At that moment, like I kind of took it under the chin, like I expected it. Like it's frontline, there's adrenaline, like that sort of stuff happens in any military in the world. But there is a limit to it. So a day later, the intelligence guys came and they picked me out of the warehouse, which by at this point had like 700 Ukrainian like soldiers in it. And they basically asked me just like very basic questions, like what unit am I in, like who am I? And then they put me back in the warehouse, and a short moment later, they called my name again. I went to the front door and they put handcuffs on me, and then they led me back to the SUV, which had like Donetsk, like People's Republic license plate on it. And I got into the back of the boot. And I remember when I got on the back, I remember telling myself like this next stage isn't going to be nice, and I was expecting like this is the part where it gets nasty.
Why was that expectation there? Because of the violence that you'd already seen, or because of the fact that you had been singled out?
I knew it was coming just because I'd been singled out, and like I said, like that small beating I had, like when I showed him my passport, like I understood that's just the way it is. We drove for about 2.5 hours. We ended up in Donetsk, which I worked out from the like just the cobblestone and like the direction of the sun and stuff. And as soon as I got out of the car, they took the bag off, and then they took the handcuffs off. And respectfully, like at that moment in time, like I had my hands behind my back out of like just like fear and respect. And some guy in a blue uniform, he immediately said something to me in Russian, but I didn't understand anything he said because I think his accent was too thick, or he was just drunk. And as soon as I said like back politely, like, can you please repeat that in Russian? That's when the beating started. So he beat me relentlessly, like with a police baton. I fell to the floor, and then he dragged me into this building and into this empty room. And he continued to beat me for about 2.5 hours, roughly. At one point, I was like knocked unconscious, and as soon as I like regained consciousness, like they just started beating me. As well as this, they were also asking me like just very basic questions related to like what my position is in the military and stuff, and like every answer I gave would be like returned with like another beating. And then there was at one point this guy who's like beating, like torturing me basically. He's having a quick cigarette break. I'm like completely shriveled up, like exhausted myself, and he's like smoking his cigarette, and he like gets down onto his like crouches down sort of, like looking at me, and he says like, did you see what I did to you? I was like, no. And then he like pointed to my shoulder, and then that's like when I looked and realized that he stabbed me. Of course I didn't feel the stabbing because of all the adrenaline that was coming from the beating. And then just after that he said about like, do you know who I am? And I was like, no. And that's when he said, I am your death. And he went on to say like, do you want a beautiful death or do you want a quick death? And at that moment, like after I'd seen I'd been stabbed, like I was pretty 100% sure that I'm gonna be like killed, just because I wasn't expecting to be stabbed. I only expected to be beaten relentlessly and stuff. So when he asked me that, I remember I replied back to him, I want a quick death. And he says, no, you're gonna have a beautiful death. And I just remember thinking like everything that was going through my head at that moment was that this is how I die.
How is it possible for someone, for a human being, to cope with that level of violence, with that level of torture?
There was the humanitarian aid worker Yuri Pool, who was also taken into captivity. He died in Russian captivity, and as soon as he died, something high up in the Russian chain of command like happened, and they basically said, take all the foreigners and put them into protective custody. At this time, I was in the Donetsk pre-trial detention center, and I'd spent all my time there in this like solitary confinement cell with other Ukrainians. We had a 2-man cell, but there was 5 of us, and I wouldn't be taken out. I'd stay there day after day. The only time I'd be taken out is for propaganda. And after this event happened, I was taken away from the Ukrainians I was with, and I was put into an empty cell, like in the same cell block. And a few moments later, my Croatian friend from the battalion, he joined me. And we had no idea like why we were there. Like we couldn't process any of it.
Having fed the Russian propaganda machine and all the rest of it, you did have a trial of sorts.
Yeah.
One in which you received, well, you were told that you were going to be receiving the death penalty. I've never sat across the desk from someone who has been in that position before. What was that like?
It's hard to put into words because like nothing can like prepare you for like that eventual outcome of like standing in a courtroom, like I should say standing in a kangaroo court where everything is already designed to be against you. I remember there was the first 2 accusations that we were charged with, which was attempting to seize the constitution of the Donetsk People's Republic or overthrow, something like that. Second one was terrorist weapons training, just because we'd gone to boot camp in the Ukrainian military. And then the third one was mercenaryism. And when it came to it, we pleaded not guilty, but we pleaded guilty to the terrorism charge and the other charge because we knew if the mercenary charge gets dropped, this whole court case collapsed because we'll be POWs. So we pleaded not guilty to the mercenary charge, and that's when I noticed my lawyer, who was, well, my fake lawyer, I call him. I noticed he was like trying to get my attention, like gesturing, like, why did you do that? And at that moment, I was like, I think we should speak to the lawyer. And he came over and he says, like, why did you say that? Like, you shouldn't have said that. And I was like, but we're not mercenaries. Like, under international law, we're protected. And that's the moment he turned to me and told me, like, there is no international law here.
But thankfully, clearly, that death sentence was not carried out. Knowing that some of your comrades are still in captivity and knowing that the war continues in the way in which it does, is there a part of you that wishes you were back there?
I was in a cell with one of the battalion majors from my battalion, and we spent like a month together. And at the end of that month, they were transferred out of there. And at that point, I thought they were exchanged. I thought they got sent to be to a prisoner exchange. I remember I got released, and the moment I got back to Britain, as soon as I got internet sorted again, I remember getting my fiance to help me find him online. I found his wife. And I was so ecstatic that I found her, and I messaged her and told her who I am. And then she replied back that he's still in captivity. And I remember when she told me that it broke me pretty mentally. I was pretty depressed when I heard that. However, luckily a month later he was exchanged. I remember I was on the train from Blackfriars in London, and I just saw a post on Facebook that there was another prison exchange, and I looked on the photo and I saw his photo, and I was so happy that I saw it, and immediately contacted his wife. And since then we speak regularly, and I met up with him back when I went to Ukraine in May this year, and that was quite an emotional time for me, especially meeting him and then my battalion commander, who I was also in captivity with.
Do you think that the conflict in Ukraine is going to have a happy ending? Will Ukraine emerge from this victorious?
I certainly hope so, and I think the important thing is that the West continues to give us the weapons and the equipment that Ukraine needs to defend itself. When this war does come to an end, which it will, there is going to be a need for a similar thing to what happened with the end of the conflict in the Balkans. There's going to be a international tribunal that's needed so that people that are responsible for the atrocities that have been committed face justice. And I think that's going to need a huge international effort. And as long as the West keeps giving them what they need, especially air defense and everything else, I think we will have some sort of success in ending this war.